name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Mother of divine grace,
Pray for us.
in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Just a few things to start out with first. As you should have gotten in the handout for the schedule for the retreat, stick around after the Sunday Mass if you can, because there will be a plenary indulgence to the blessing that's attached. And also try and observe silence to the degree that you can. You can talk with your spouse, but try and do it in such a way it doesn't disturb other people. Of course, usually on marriage retreats, that's the last person they want to talk to. All right. Also, if you haven't made a general confession, or if you have questions about how to make one, I'll be happy to discuss with you. CC should have put out a list or a piece of paper where you can sign if you want to come see me. Now, you can come see me either as a couple or individually if you want to just talk about some particular spiritual matter, or if you want to go to confession or something of that sort. I have a handout. Some of you have already seen this, I'm sure. Some of you haven't. Enough here. If there isn't. This is a talk which I gave a few years ago, which deals with marital roles, which I'm not going to spend too much time on this here in this retreat, except for insofar as how to, in each particular role, how to attain perfection in that role. I'm not going to be spending too much time in trying to delineate the roles, only because hopefully you already know what it is, but it'll come out a little bit in the course of this retreat. Also, feel free to walk around and to the scenery around here is quite good. It's a great place to walk. If you need spiritual reading, you have to be rather selective, though. There is stuff along the inside here in the wall, and inside this hall there along the walls. There's some spiritual reading if you didn't bring any in addition to this, but be very careful what you pick out of there. Some of it's good, some of it you have to be careful with. Okay. The first talk I want to give is on the nature of marriage. Given the Supreme Court ruling today, it seems almost inevitable in the offing that they're going to strike down marital laws defining marriage between one man and one woman, of course. I think it's coming, even though they always say no, it's not, but I think it is. Marriage is defined in different ways by different people, but the Church has a very concise definition. Marriage is a sacrament of the new law, so it's one which Christ instituted, by which a man and a woman contract or enter into contract of bodily rights. Now, what that means is that when you get married, you actually, even though it doesn't say that too much, I'll take it for richer and poor, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse. Just last weekend I was at a marriage, and the priest gave the homily and was talking about one married couple, and the woman, something happened to her husband, and they said, well, you could get a divorce, and she said, no, I'm married for better or for worse, and we just happened to get worse. So I imagine there's some people who think I got the worst end of it, but hopefully that's not the case. All right. At least I hope that you don't think that. The point is that marriage has a twofold aspect. There's a natural aspect of it, which is on the level of justice, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Then the second part is on the sacramental level. And both the natural aspect, or the natural finality and ordering, actually comes under the sacramental aspect. A contract, of course, is a matter of justice. There is a lot of talk today in shifting the discussion of the nature of marriage from a contract to one of a covenant. Now, there's a bit of a difficulty that I find in trying to make that shift. One is that it states that marriage is founded in love. Not really. Marriage is actually founded in justice, which we'll see here in a minute. While love is an important part and a necessary part of marriage, and hopefully you love your spouse, the fact of the matter is that it's not an essential part of marriage. It's a necessary but it's not an essential part of marriage. What's the essential part of marriage is that you render justice to your partner, because that's the nature of the contract. When you got married, you conceded bodily rights to the other individual, which means that you have to not only render the marital debt, but you also have to render the things that go with conceding bodily rights to your spouse, which we'll see a little bit later. But it comes down, for instance, in the case of a husband, when he gets married, when a guy marries a wife and becomes married, he has to not only render the marital debt, but he has to she has a right for him to go use his body to support her so that she can properly raise the children at home. That's a right that she has. Now, it's ironic that in the age of feminism, women are trying to claim all sorts of rights other than the one that they actually have. They have a right to stay home unless, like every other right, it's not absolute. So there can be circumstances where she may have to actually work, but she has a right to stay home to raise the children or to take care of the domestic affairs because that's her proper role. But the point is it's a matter of right. And on the other hand, he has a right not only for her to render the marital debt, but also that she stays home and takes care of his children or her children. So he actually has that right. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's a distinction between bed and board. It's not just rendering the marital act in the bed. There is more to it than that. There is what's called the board, which means she has a right to be supported to the degree that she, obviously circumstances can happen and he may not be able to do it given the current economic circumstances or whatever. But she has a right to be supported and to be able to be freed so that she can take care of the children. He, on the other hand, has a right to come home to his wife. Now, obviously this is rooted in roles, but it's a matter of what the contract is. And this is actually governed by the natural law. The point is that by switching it to try and switch the language to covenant, what happens is that the legal aspects or the justice aspects, the rights that people have, are diminished. Justice means that once you contract, the person has bodily rights over the other individual once the marriage is contracted. And that means in justice, the person has to render the marital debt at every reasonable request. Every reasonable request doesn't mean every time, it just means reasonable request. So you can't, it's not the type of thing that you can say, well, I got a headache, or I want to go plow the field, or whatever. If the person makes a reasonable request, it has to be because, why? They have a right to it. Justice also means that you cannot use the marital goods to manipulate each other or to punish each other, which very often happens in marriage. One of the partners does something, so the husband, like for instance, the wife will do something. She'll go out and buy a set of curtains that the husband's a little annoyed with. So what does he do? He punishes her by giving her the silent treatment, or by refusing to have any discussion with her, or even to render the marital debt. Completely, in fact, it's a moral sin. The theologians will tell you that's a moral sin. To manipulate the spouse by using that, or to actually refuse it, is a mortal sin. When it's reasonable, of course, it still has to be reasonable. Marriage, so in other words, it's a contract, so the relationship that they have is actually rooted in justice. Now, justice is in the will, and that means that if you're going to love the spouse, or if you're going to render justice, you will actually will for them what is due to them. So it's still a matter of, well, you have to will it. But that means that in the will, it makes that willing, or to render to them what's due to them, a little easier if you love them, obviously. And so as a result, that's one of the principal reasons why, for instance, St. Paul says, husband, love your wives. We'll see why that is later in the men's part of the thing. But the point is that it makes it easier to will the good for the other individual. It also makes it easier if you understand that there's a matter of justice and that you're bound to this person. It can also make it a little easier if you have a bit of virtue, particularly benignity and benevolence. Benevolence is willing the disposition by which you will other people good, particularly those who are close to you. And benignity is the actual, you do the good for the other individual. So people who are unwilling to do good things for their spouse don't have benignity. We'll talk about a little bit more about that later. But that means that if you're going to render somebody their due, you have to have some degree of benevolence, because what's due to them is some good thing. And so as a result, you have to have some benevolence when you're married. So it's first rooted in justice. And that means that insofar as it's rooted in justice, marriage is what we call a natural law institution. Now what the natural law is that God, in making human nature, designed him to function in specific ways by the faculties and the nature that he gave them. We see this with a dog, for instance. A dog goes around, it barks, it bites, and things like that. It doesn't go around engaging in rational discourse. Even the little chihuahua has to be spruced up a little bit on TV. So the point is that that human nature, on the other hand, is designed for specific kinds of ends or designed for specific kinds of actions. God intended us to behave in a specific way. This means in relationship to marriage that it's based on three things then. The proper use of the body in relationship to the other individual, the justice to render towards them. So the first is on the level of the body, the second is on the level of the will, that's justice, and the third is on the level of reason, because why? You can't get married unless you can at least understand what you're getting yourself into. Okay, so it's based upon the natural law. This means also that marriage is ordered towards giving God glory through the bringing of souls into the world who will worship him. In other words, marriage, by its principal end and its principal goal, is the bringing about of children. Now that doesn't mean if somebody doesn't have children that somehow there's something wrong, morally wrong with them, of course. All it means is that God had established marriage so that people would propagate, and that's precisely why he made it. And he designed our faculties to be able to do that. So that is, and so it's ordered towards his glory. We'll see that a little bit later. But it's done by bringing souls into the world. This primary end, therefore, is primary. It means that the principal reason people get married is to have children. You know, you hear this from time to time. People will say things like, well, yeah, we're getting married. Well, when are you going to have children? Well, we're not ready yet. We're going to wait a few years. Well, then you're not ready to get married. That's the basic gist. If you're not prepared from the day that you get married to start having children, then you're not ready to get married, because that's the principal end of this contract that you're getting into. The second one, of course, the second end of marriage is the mutual love and support of the spouses. Now, this second end of marriage is not the same thing as the second end of the conjugal act. There's been a lot of blurring of distinctions as of late. You'll hear people say, well, they'll say, well, the secondary end of the conjugal act is the mutual love of the spouses. No, it is not. That's the third end. The second end, the two primary ends, of course, of the conjugal act are union and procreation. Procreation being the principal, and the means to that procreation is union, and those are the two principal ends. So having children is the principal end, union is the second. Physical union. Doesn't talk about love. The church up until recently, the church never talked about love being the secondary end of marriage. They did always talk about it as an end of marriage and a necessary thing. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to downplay marital love. That's not my point. My point is to put it in the proper understanding, but put it in the proper context. So the primary end of marriage is having children. The primary end of the conjugal act is having children. The secondary end of marriage is mutual love and support of the spouses. That is, they help support each other, help each other to fulfill their duties and their states in life. Then the second and secondary end of the conjugal act is union. And then the third end of the conjugal act and marriage, or the third end of the conjugal act is mutual love. That's its primary. That's the third end. Just so we have that in context, because what's happened is in our sentimental and sappy culture, people have elevated the love dimension to the top. And so why do people get love? Oh, you get love because we're getting married because we're in love. Well, that's a good reason to want to get married. But you should be getting married because you want to have children and you want to start raising a family. Now, obviously, many of you are old enough to know this, but just so that and that many of you are old enough to know that that children are the natural effect of this, which seems to be more and more denied lately. So that's the natural aspect. It's a matter of justice, render the other person their due. It's based in natural law, and it has these ends. And these ends are determined, again, by the way God designed us. So, as a result, the natural law is one of those things that if we don't follow the natural law, then the natural trajectory of that is unhappiness. Why? Well, it's analogous to when you build a car, you build it in such a way so that I put gas in the gas tank and oil in the engine, and if I do all the things it's supposed to, if I treat the car right, then it'll run properly, because I'm doing what it's designed to do. But if I put water in the gas tank, well, eventually the engine's going to quit, or it's going to start acting weird. Or if I get under the hood and I start yanking things out, then eventually the thing's not going to run properly, it'll run very poorly. It's the exact same way as it is with human beings. God designed us in a specific way, and that means He meant it to function in a specific way. And if you go in and you start being sterilized to do various things, and it's like the thing doesn't function properly, and eventually people end up unhappy. And this also applies to, in marriage, selfishness is a serious problem. It's a serious problem because we're all affected by original sin, but it can become a big problem within the context of marriage. And so as a result, this is one of the reasons why the legal aspects of it are so important. If I'm basing it only on love, well, then when the love evaporates, there goes my marriage. But if I'm doing this as, okay, I am contracting responsibilities and obligations in relationship to this other person, then there is a foundation for the permanency of the marriage. Marriage is a sacrament. What marriage does as a sacrament is it raises the natural law institution. So from the very beginning, from when Adam and Eve were walking around, God had established marriage as an institution from the very beginning. And they didn't have the sacrament of matrimony. Sacramental matrimony didn't begin until Christ came. And so as a result, there was a natural law institution, and there still actually is a natural law institution for those who are unaware of the gospel and unable to contract the sacrament because of whatever reason. So they are able to enter still into a natural law marriage, but it's forbidden to Catholics, of course. Catholics have to be married sacramentally, otherwise even the natural law aspects that the Church considers null. All right. So what the Church does, what God does is He takes this natural law institution and then He raises it to the level of a sacrament. And what does that mean? It means that there's a conferral of a sacrament. Now, sacrament is an outward sign, so you exchange vows, instituted by Christ to give grace. So it's actually ordered towards actually giving you grace. The natural law institution as such is only dispositive towards grace. If I follow the natural law, that disposes me towards receiving grace, but it doesn't give me grace. Whereas once you're married, you actually get sanctifying grace to help you sanctifying and actual grace to help survive the marriage. The actual grace, the two principal effects of actual grace are to enlighten the mind and strengthen the will. That means that if you have the sacrament of matrimony and you're receiving the graces from that sacrament, the sacrament, of course, is ordered towards permanency and the fidelity that you pledge as a vow, helps you to fulfill that. Then it gives you the actual strength of will to be able to do that. And if you dispose yourself, then the grace becomes more operative and it's much more easier to will the permanency and to remain within the confines of your marriage. But it also means that throughout the course, that once you contract the sacrament of matrimony, you can perpetually, until the other person dies, until the spouse dies, you can continually draw sanctifying, not only sanctifying grace, but actual grace in order to keep yourself on the straight and level course in the will. And it also enlightens the mind, which means that it will help you to see what's necessary to help each other, to help to survive within the context of the modern world, of course. Most people simply do not draw off their sacramental graces properly. Usually within most marriages, the natural dimension to it just completely dominates, and the supernatural dimension is not even paid too much attention to. This also means that when God raised it to a supernatural level, He specifically intended to use matrimony and order it directly towards the salvation of each other's souls. So what does this mean? It means that God gives grace through the sacrament in order for the mutual spouses to be able to A, save their own soul, and to save the soul of their other spouse. And this is important because in the end, when we say that in the natural institution, the primary end is having children, in the supernatural level, which is even more primary, the primary end is the salvation of each other's souls. So you're probably thinking to yourself, I'm having a real hard time saving my soul around this spouse. What this means is, if you're having a difficulty in marriage saving your soul, you're finding it difficult, then what it means is that A, you're not drawing enough on the sacramental graces, and B, you're not working on the requisite virtues. C, are you offering up the suffering that your spouse causes you for the sake of the other spouse? That actually comes up a little bit in the talk that I handed out, but most people fail to offer up adequate prayers and sufferings for their spouse. Praying isn't enough. Christ said, the apostles go out and they couldn't cast out some of the demons, and Christ said, well, some demons have to be cast out by prayer and fasting. Well, that is actually the same case in the context of marriage. Some spouses just require fasting and praying in order to bring them around. Now, on the other hand, it can also be that if your spouse is causing you problems, the problem might be on your side. So whenever you see, and this is quite revealing to people, if you are perfectly sanctified, now sanctified perfection consists in excellence and grace, you have a lot of grace, and the adornment of the soul of all of the virtues. So you're perfectly virtuous in every way. That's sanctified perfection. If your spouse does something that annoys you, then that is a sign to you that you are weak in some virtue. There's some virtue you're lacking. Whether it's patience or long-suffering or whatever the case may be, you're lacking this. Whereas if you had perfect virtue, it didn't matter what your spouse would do. You'd have perfect equanimity. It didn't mean you wouldn't be concerned if they did something rather odd, but it just means that you could take it with perfect equanimity. And that when they did these things, you would be able to have the clarity of mind to look at your spouse and say, okay, I see he's having a difficulty with this, I have to do this in order to help him. Or anytime he does something that annoys me, I'm going to offer it up for him. And if you get into that habit, then two things happen. One, you're actually meriting grace for the guy, so you can actually, provided you're in the state of grace, so you're actually helping him. The second thing is that you're building virtue, and so as time goes on, it becomes easier, and so the difficulty of your with your spouse becomes less of a difficulty for you, at least. And then lastly, the other thing it does too is that it helps you to have a more positive aspect or outlook on your spouse, because you're actually doing something good for them, rather than the minute they do something, interiorly. Spouses usually, as they get a little older, get pretty good at mastering the interior irritation. So the spouse, because they know if they verbalize it, it's just going to broil things up and it gets worse and things go downhill. But the point is that, unless of course you're perfectly virtuous, both of you, and so then you may not have any of these problems. But original sin being what it is, most people suffer from these things. And so it's important that we actually view our spouse in the proper way. That is, to recognize that it's your duty to actually help your spouse save his or her soul. When you stand before God, and you might have committed sins because of your spouse isn't going to be there to defend you, and you're not going to be able to point fingers at your spouse. You're going to have to pay the price for it on your own. On the other hand, if you didn't do what you're supposed to do, your spouse gets to stand there and accuse you of not helping them out in the proper circumstances, although they probably won't have to do that because God will reveal it anyway and everyone will see it. But the point is that you have to make sure that you're taking responsibility for any difficulty within the context of your family on your own. This salvation of the souls becomes the primary end over all others. Grace also aids one. The sacramental graces are directly ordered towards fulfilling the vows. So, fidelity to the other spouse, and also in marital with respect to the justice aspects, it helps you to render those aspects. But it also helps the person to fulfill their duties according to their state. In other words, because they're married, now there's certain responsibility. Fulton Sheen used to say that there are two ways in which somebody grows up, either by suffering or by responsibility. I heard that from somebody, so I have to give them credit, whoever they may be. But the point is that marriage brings responsibility and suffering. So, if you rise to the occasion and take the responsibility for those things that you're supposed to and fulfill your duties, and that's based upon your roles, if you fulfill that, then you'll mature. But if you don't, if you're really unwilling to take on the responsibilities, then there's a certain amount of immaturity. And second, if you're unwilling to accept the suffering that goes along in marriage, which may not even come as the result of your spouse, it may become because of children or just things outside your marriage or whatever. If you're unwilling to suffer those things, you're never going to be properly mature. In fact, I argue that maturity ultimately consists in sanctified perfection, which means that a person just simply has all the virtues. Because if a person is perfectly mature, then they'll put up with any difficulty that comes along with equanimity. They don't react. They don't throw a tantrum like a kid. They don't get angry disordinately. So as a result, the person who is mature is the one who actually reaches a certain level of, it's the saint. That's what it is. It's the person who reaches a certain level of sanctified perfection. And in marriage, one of the principal ways in which you grow holy is through the defects of your spouse. Now, many of you have heard me say this before, but the circumstances merit saying it again. One time, a spiritual directee wrote to St. John of the Cross and said, and I think they also said this happened to Padre Pio, St. Padre Pio. They sent, a spiritual directee sent a letter to St. John of the Cross and said, she was a nun, she said, I could become a very holy nun if it wasn't for the rest of the nuns in the convent. Well, the same thing actually applies in the context of marriage. I'm sure many people think, I could be much holier if it wasn't for my spouse or children or circumstances or whatever. St. John of the Cross gives the perfect answer. He writes back and he says, it's quite the contrary. It's the defects of the other nuns which become the moments of your growing in virtue and holiness through suffering. And that's precisely how you have to view it in the context of the family. Obviously, you don't want your spouse to be a wretch so that you can become holy. That's not the point. Because it is true, too, that the virtues of the other individual do aid and support each other, and it helps both of them. But at the same time, you have to look at the defects within the context of your marriage as actually aiding, if you look at it with the proper perspective. And this grace helps you to fulfill your duties and to help you to always do what's necessary in the context of your spouse. And so you can draw on the sacramental graces not just on the day of your wedding, but every single day of your life until both die, or one of them dies. Marriage, of course, also, St. Thomas says that fidelity, of course, which is exclusivity, that is, you exclusively are with one spouse, this fidelity is both on the level of the natural law, and it's also on the level of the sacrament. Because once you contract the sacrament, there is one instance in which the sacrament of matrimony can actually be dissolved by the Pope, and that is when when the marriage has not been consummated. Then, for a just and good reason, the spouses can actually have the marriage dissolved. Most people don't know that. There was actually a case, it's kind of interesting, there was a case of a guy who was trying to get an annulment. And he and his wife had 5 kids. And he argued that he should be able to get an annulment based on the fact that the marriage was never consummated. And he got it. Because, actually he got the marriage dissolved because they had all the children before they contracted the sacrament of matrimony. So the point is that what is the point? The point is that this fidelity, that the sacrament is ordered towards perfect fidelity, and this fidelity is not merely just with respect to the conjugal act, but even of affections. You should not be looking to have your the romantic affections and things like that with any other person. You know, you hear this business when people say, "Well, I'm married, so that means I can look and not touch." Nah. You can't even look. If by look you mean actually allowing your affections to fall on somebody else. Just as a priest the perfection for a priest consists in not only foregoing the goods of marriage, but to gain perfect detachment from them. It also means for the spouses that their affections become perfectly detached in relationship to other people, at least in the context of the marriage. So that is, that they can only allow their affections to fall upon their spouse. And this also means with respect to thoughts as well. The ring, of course, in marriage is a sign of bondage. You're bound together now. And you're bound together as one insofar as you become not only one flesh in the conjugal act, that's part of it, but you also should be seeking to become one in heart, of course, in the sense of through perfect virtue. You can grow in love towards each other, which incidentally, if you want your spouse to love you more, become virtuous. Because Aristotle says that friendship and love, ultimately, St. Thomas says love, is based upon some good or virtue that you see in the individual. If you don't think your spouse loves you enough, become more virtuous. And it'll actually draw the spouse into loving you more. But this ring, this bond, binds one together to become one of heart, and so that you can faithfully execute the things that are necessary as heads of your children. Obviously, those of you who have had children know clearly that you kind of get this triangulating that goes on with children. You go to the mom, "Mom, can I go out tonight?" "No." So then they sneak off. "Dad, can I go out tonight?" "Yeah, you can go out." So you have to be very careful about that, in the sense of not to be suspicious of your children, although that tends to come naturally with having them. But you do have to try and act together cohesively and coherently for the good of the family. And also, love, St. Thomas says that one of the natural effects of love is union. You become one. And that is, the person seeks union with the beloved. And if you really love your spouse, then it means that, not necessarily that you want to spend all your time together, but that you will always want to act together with one mind and one heart in the context of the family, and also act together insofar as is good for each other. This sacrament of marriage also helps one in chastity. Now, it is a common misperception that once you're married you don't have to observe chastity. That's just absurd. Chastity is the virtue in the concupiscible appetite. It's that part of us which desires conjugal relations. And it moderates that. It keeps it toned down and keeps it moderated. What this means is that, obviously for a priest or for someone who's single, that means you have to have perfect chastity, you have to have perfect moderation. You can't give in to the thoughts or the desires in any way whatsoever. In the context of marriage, it means that the conjugal act has to be governed by the natural law. In other words, it has to be moderated according to due circumstances and due mode. We'll be talking about that with the men. And it has to be taken into consideration the good of the other spouse and things like that. So once you get married, it's not just license in this regard. There is actually a chastity, so that they can actually grow through chastity. In fact, St. Augustine says that one of the principal ends of marriage is to help each other to overcome lust, so that it's properly directed and that they can overcome this together. Grace, of course, helps to sustain the trials of marriage, which may not necessarily come from each other, as I mentioned, but just life in general, this grace of the sacrament. Grace also helps to seek self-detachment. What self-detachment is that one has a certain indifference regarding oneself. Now, that doesn't mean that one just lets oneself get walked on. It's not the case at all. What it means is that the person doesn't really care so much what happens to them as long as the right thing is done. So in other words, the self-detachment is ultimately ordered more perfectly towards charity. That is, I want to love and do what's necessary for the sake of my spouse and for those around me. And so what happens is, through this grace, if we continue to work on the self-detachment, through the grace of the sacrament, and the people that are married can actually gain a great deal of self-detachment. 99% of marital problems stem from lack of self-detachment, because either people are too attached to the way they spend money, they're too attached to the way the things are arranged in the home, they're too attached towards certain behaviors on the side of their spouse, or they're attached to something in them which if the spouse doesn't satisfy, they're irritated. And so as a result, if a person gains perfect self-detachment, it will greatly smooth over the things in marriage. Now, that doesn't mean that if one spouse becomes perfectly detached, that somehow or another the other spouse just turns wonderful. No, but it does aid a great deal through charity, because you don't become self-detached just for no reason whatsoever. We're not Buddhists. We're actually Christians, of course, Catholics, which means that our self-detachment is ordered towards we don't love ourselves except insofar as we love God. Now, what that means is that we're not attached to self. We're ultimately attached to God. Charity is not love of God and love of neighbor. Now, many of you have heard me ramble about this, but it's important, again, to bring this up in this context. Charity is love of God and love of neighbor for the sake of God. It's not just loving your neighbor. Christ said, look at the Gentiles do as much. No, that's not... charity is love of neighbor for the sake of God. Now, that means that in the context of your marriage, that perfect love of spouse consists of perfect charity, which means you don't love your spouse for natural reasons. You don't love them with a natural love. You love them with a supernatural love, which means you love them for no other reason than willing the good for God, which comes to the good of your spouse. I'm going to talk about that more later, about the virtues. But this is one of the principal ends of self-detachment. You have to become detached if you're going to become perfect within the context of your marriage. And it's also, self-detachment, of course, is necessary just to live together, because you don't have complete control over anything anymore once you're married. There's always a certain amount of give and take. And it's also the case with respect to finances. There has to be a great deal of detachment regarding the finances. Obviously, too, this grace aids one in fulfilling the other duties of the state of marriage, which I have not talked about. But it's important to do three things within the confines of marriage. Of course, pray together, but we'll talk more about that later. You also have to, in the context of the virtue of prayer, you have to pray. You have to do penances for each other and for the sake of your children, which comes out in the talk. And the third is you have to be striving actively for virtues, which means you better know what the virtues are. You need to get books and read the things in order to know what the actual virtues are. You can learn a lot about it through the lives of saints, but you need to know what the virtues are, because it's only through virtue that the marital life is smoothed out. If you don't have virtue, your marital life is simply going to be difficult. It's that simple. So the moral of the story is obey the natural law, which comes with which virtue does, and always have fidelity to the graces that God sends you in the confines of marriage. These graces come, they give these little inclinations. The person sees this would be the better thing to do now. Repetitively, they might not want to do it, but you have to hold on to those graces. And if you're always faithful to those graces, and if you're striving for virtue, your marriage can be much smoother than maybe it already is, or if it's already smooth, it can greatly aid each other spiritually, which of course the end is to save each other's souls. Right. If you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper. Amen.